Early this month, my family and I were volunteering for Baltimore votes at the Highlandtown Pratt Library early voting site. A black man walked out of the polling place, and we offered him some refreshments and a sign to put in his window. He declined, clearly in a hurry. My son called out, "Thank you for voting." As he walked by, he briefly turned toward us and said, "Thank you for not suppressing." I thought to myself, is the bar really that low? Unfortunately, I think it is. Against the backdrop of the pandemic and many sins of the outgoing president and his administration, a silver lining has been the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the Women's March, the youth-led March for Our Lives, and overall more widespread grassroots advocacy than this country has ever seen in its 245-year history. Each of these movements and more have rightly demanded we move beyond calls for basic civility toward the need for structural and systemic change. Many Americans have become more sensitized to the ways politeness, colorblindness, and liberal do-goodership have been complicit in maintaining systems of oppression against women, LGBTQ people, black and brown people, Jews, the disabled, and more. Civility isn't enough. As we've discussed before, civility can actually be part of the problem because it can mean avoiding confrontation and essential truth-telling. To dismantle racism and sexism and homophobia and anti-Semitism, we need to go deeper. We need to work harder. I think this is why I was so taken aback by CNN anchor Van Jones' widely shared emotional speech after Joe Biden was declared to be the next president of the United States. Speaking through tears, Jones said, "It's easier to be a parent this morning. It's easier to be a dad. It's easier to tell your kids that character matters. It matters. Telling the truth matters. Being a good person matters." Jones was speaking an essential truth. Civility is also important. In Yiddish, if you want to describe someone truly admirable, you call them a mensch, a fundamentally good person. Being a mensch isn't about fighting for justice versus speaking and acting with compassion. It's about both of those things. Provocation without compassion can be cruel, and cruelty should be no one's aspiration. My father, whose yahrzeit begins tonight, used to say, "Two wrongs don't make a right." I didn't hear Van Jones live, of course. I was in the middle of leading Shabbat morning services with all of you. But I did get word about the election outcome soon after CNN called it. If you were with us last Shabbos, you know I had just finished teaching a section from the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, about minhag stom. That is, the practices for which, in the rabbinic imagination, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah needed to be destroyed. Many crimes were listed, but for me the most upsetting was the way even kindness was weaponized. When a poor person would come to Sodom, each and every Sodomite would give him a dinar, that is a coin, and the name of the giver was written on each dinar, and then they would not give or sell him bread. When he died, presumably of hunger, each and every person would come and take back his dinar. It's one thing to systematically withhold assistance. That in and of itself is unacceptable as an expression of basic cultural mores. But to provide assistance as a false flag and then deny human beings the dignity of acquiring vital sustenance is brutality on a different order of magnitude. The emotional release that Van Jones experienced when he learned a man known for pettiness and cruelty would no longer occupy the White House was, I suspect, a catharsis felt by many of us last Saturday. But it's hard to feel consistently at peace right now, isn't it? COVID numbers are soaring, spinning out of control. The election results are clear, but the transition of power, the basic mechanisms of the republic are under siege. And then it seemed all of these amazing people died. Last week, Sean Connery. This week, Alex Trebek. Lucille Bridges died. She was the activist and mother who escorted her daughter Ruby past apoplectic and violent white protesters to enroll her in previously segregated William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. That seminal moment happened November 14th, 1960, exactly 60 years ago today. Lucille and Ruby Bridges were heroic, to be sure, but heroism is often stifled by entrenched hatred or fear and institutional bias. Would that Ruby's story had had a Hollywood ending. Instead, this is what the New York Times reported back in 1984. After her integration move, Mrs. Hall said, while most white parents immediately took their children out of France, and the all-white school eventually became all black. One by one, white children returned. Integration was costly for Ruby Hall's family. The NAACP had to support her parents for several years because they lost their jobs when the integration step made headlines. Friends in their all-black neighborhood took turns guarding their home. The problem with Brown versus Board of Education is that while it ended de jure, that is legal school segregation for students, it surely didn't end racism. White students fled. In schools that remained racially integrated, black teachers were replaced with white ones to placate white parents who didn't want their own children taught by African American instructors. Racism ensured that the inferior performance of black students became a statistical self-fulfilling prophecy. American integrated public education was a bait and switch worthy of ancient Sodom. Today, American schools remain as segregated as ever. Ruby Hall eventually pulled her own children out of public school and sent them to Catholic schools. We may feel good about Brown versus Board. By many measures, it made society more civil, less cruel. But we must ask the question, were rights more equitably distributed? Did our civility match our societal integrity? Which brings me to one final noteworthy death, the passing this week of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. Rabbi Sacks was a rare voice of his stature and position, calling for a true integration of mission and menschlichkeit. His post-9/11 book, The Dignity of Difference, is a modern classic, espousing a global ethic at a time of increasing jingoism and nativism. Eschewing overt political rhetoric himself, Sacks nevertheless provides ample source material for those who wish to apply ancient Jewish wisdom and sources to our contemporary social and political environment. How appropriate, then, that the commentary he previously scheduled to be published this week is all about legacy. Sacks noticed that this parsha, which begins with Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, includes the deaths of both Sarah and Abraham. Sacks speaks of leadership, how a life well led still leaves by design missions left unfulfilled. The most important point of this parsha, he writes, is that large promises, a land, countless children, become real through small beginnings. Leaders begin with an envisioned future, but they also know that there is a long journey between here and there. We can only reach it one act at a time, one day at a time. There is no miraculous shortcut, and if there were, it would not help. He goes on, the use of a shortcut would culminate in an achievement like Jonah's gourd, which grew overnight, then died overnight. Abraham acquired only a single field and had just one son who would continue the covenant. Yet he did not complain, and he died serene and satisfied because he had begun, because he had left future generations something on which to build. All great change is the work of more than one generation, and none of us will live to see the full fruit of our endeavors. Reading Sacks's words, I can't help but still feel hopeful for the future. Yes, suppressing votes or not suppressing votes is a low bar, to be sure. Yes, the poison of racism and isolationism runs through the veins of this country and too much of the world. Yes, the work ahead of us is daunting. In the coming months and years, we'll need to rediscover our societal compassion while resisting the complacency that allows civility to mask the need for truth, reconciliation, and justice. None of this is easy. Abraham's world wasn't easy either. His journey was an arduous one. But our Parsha tells us that he died zaken v'savea, old and contented. Leaders, says Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, in his commentary this week, see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind them those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality. May we all be blessed in the coming months and years to embrace our tenacity, rediscover our humanity, and secure our own immortality. Shabbat Shalom.